when a homeless child shouted, "Don't eat that." No one expected what would happen next. In the heat of an afternoon, this corner of the park was the meeting point for Sao Paulo's elite. Between pruned trees and the murmur of a fountain, the restaurant was packed. Waiters in impeccable uniforms glided between the tables, balancing trays with gourmet dishes and freshly brewed coffee. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and the sweet scent of flowers, but for one man none of that seemed to matter. At a central table sat Ricardo Albuquerque, a name synonymous with power and fortune. He built his empire from scratch, starting with real estate in his 20s and expanding into businesses that few dared to dream of. At 72, he exuded the confidence of someone who not only owned his own world, but perhaps the world of everyone around him. His impeccable suit and gold-rimmed glasses reflected a life of luxury. Even so, when he looked at the menu, his movements were slow, almost hesitant. Across from him was Natalia, his much younger wife, a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine. Her black hair framed a face impeccably made up with vibrant red lipstick. Every detail screamed elegance, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. She twirled a diamond bracelet on her wrist. Distracted, her attention glued to her cell phone screen. Nearby, a boy was watching from outside the restaurant's fence. He was skinny for the girl, with a sweatshirt that was too big for his thin body. His dark eyes darted from table to table, analyzing plates and pockets, looking for an opportunity. His name was Mateus, although no one in the restaurant knew him. His face was familiar on that street, a homeless boy, always on the sidelines of conversations and worries. Ricardo looked at his watch, distracted again. He said in a calm but firm voice. Natalia looked up and smiled without showing any affection. "I'm here," she replied sweetly, reaching her hand for his. "You know how I love these lunches." Mateus's stomach growled. He approached, his footsteps almost silent, leaning against the patio railing. His eyes stopped at Ricardo's table. It was the kind of meal he hadn't seen up close in months. A white bowl of soup with fresh bread on the side and a glass of sparkling water. But then something strange happened. As Ricardo adjusted his glasses and reached for his cell phone, Natalia's hand slid into her designer bag. Mateus saw her fingers close around a small jar. She opened it with a casual movement, tilting her hand over the steaming bowl. The liquid mixed with the soup in an instant, disappearing as if it had never been there. Mateus held his breath. He froze, watching her stir the soup with the spoon, her expression unchanged. Then she leaned toward Ricardo, her voice low but audible. "After all the trouble I've gone to, you're not going to ruin it now." The boy blinked, unsure of what he had just witnessed. This was real, a woman so perfect, sitting in such an elegant place. Would she really be capable of doing that? Mateus couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. His heart was pounding as he ducked behind the fence. He didn't know what he had seen, but the coldness in the woman's words made him shiver. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. No one else noticed. No one else was paying attention. It was just him. The faint rumble in his stomach brought him back to reality, but his eyes remained fixed on the couple. Ricardo looked tired, distracted. His spoon hovered over the bowl as he looked at his cell phone. Natalia was all charm and poise. Her smile was brilliant, her hand resting on her chin, as if she hadn't just whispered something horrifying. Mateus felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders. His instincts screamed at him to leave. Why get involved in this? Who would believe a boy like him? Wearing a worn-out sweatshirt on the fringes of a world that didn't welcome him. He swallowed hard, looking at the other customers. Laughter, conversation, clinking glasses. No one cared, no one even noticed him, but his gaze returned to Ricardo's spoon, now dipping into the soup. Mateus felt his chest tighten. It wasn't his imagination. He saw the woman putting something there. He knew what would happen if the old man ate that. His thoughts raced. He didn't know that man, but that didn't matter. Wrong was wrong. Time seemed to move. Then, without thinking, Mateus pushed away from the railing and went straight to the table. His legs felt like lead, but his feet wouldn't stop. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't eat that." Heads turned, conversation stopped mid-sentence. The sound of a fork falling echoed through the restaurant. Ricardo stopped with the spoon inches from his mouth. His wide eyes fixed on the boy. Natalia turned her head sharply, her expression hardening. "What did you just say?" she demanded in a sharp voice. Mateus didn't hesitate, his voice trembled, loud enough for everyone to hear. She put something in your food. I saw it, don't eat that. Whispers spread through the restaurant as all the diners turned to look at the scene. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mateus stood firm, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through his body. Ricardo blinked, looking from the boy to his wife. What is he talking about? He asked, his voice calm, but his hand trembling as he placed the spoon on the table. Natalia's composure snapped like an overstretched rubber band. She jumped to her feet, her chair scraping against the stone floor. You little liar, she hissed, her voice full of venom. How dare you accuse me of something so low? Who let you in here? The words stung, but Mateus didn't back down. His eyes remained fixed on Ricardo's, desperate for him to see the truth. I saw her. She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking. You can smell it. If you don't believe me. Ricardo's face paled as he turned to his wife, his eyes narrowing. Natalia, what's going on? He asked in a low but firm voice. She scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. He just wants to cause trouble. Look at him. He probably just wants money or food. She spat the words like venom, her gaze returning to Mateus with contempt. But the boy didn't waver. He approached the table, his fists clenched. I'm not lying, he said firmly, his voice rising. She doesn't want you to know, but I saw everything. Ricardo's hand hovered over the bowl, torn between disbelief and the doubt that was now settling in his mind. But something in the boy's tone made him hesitate. The air around the table seemed to thicken. The previously lively restaurant was now silent. All eyes were fixed on the scene, their meals forgotten. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, studying the boy with an analytical gaze. His face bore the marks of a man accustomed to people playing games with him, trying to take advantage of his wealth, but this was different. The boy was not intimidated, did not look away. Mateus, Ricardo asked in a firm voice, although with a trace of suspicion. The boy nodded. Yes, I am telling the truth. Please, don't eat it, he said in a soft but insistent voice. Natalia let out a bitter laugh, crossing her arms as she glared at Mateus. That's absurd, she snapped in an icy tone. He's just a street urchin wanting attention. Are you really going to pay attention to that nonsense? But Ricardo didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the spoon again, bringing it close to his face. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the silent storm that was brewing inside him. Natalia, he said slowly, his eyes meeting hers. Did you hear him? What exactly is going on here? Quote. Natalia's mask of composure cracked even further, her lips pressing into a thin line. I can't believe you're asking me that. It's insulting. She turned to the crowd. Her voice rose. He's lying. Look at him. He probably doesn't even know who you are. Why would you trust him over me? The weight of her words hung in the air, but it didn't have the desired effect. The crowd murmured, their eyes jumping between the three of them. Whispers floated in the air. Did she really do it? Look at her, she looks nervous. This kid doesn't seem to be making this up. The murmurs only increased Natalia's fury. She slammed her hands on the table, her impeccable posture disappearing. Enough of this, Ricardo. Eat this damn soup and let's go, she hissed, her voice shaking with anger. But Mateus didn't back down. He took another step forward, his fists clenched. If you don't believe me, then call someone to test it, he said, his voice rising in urgency. You're rich, you have lawyers, doctors, people who can find out, but don't eat it. If you do, you'll regret it. Ricardo's jaw clenched as he turned to face her. The spoon was still in his hand, but he didn't bring it to his lips. His tired, calculating eyes shifted to his wife. Natalia, he said quietly, you've been acting strange for weeks. Her face flushed and she stammered. I don't know what you're talking about. Do you really think I would poison you? Poison me? Quote. Ricardo finished for her in a sharp tone. The crowd gasped audibly, their whispers increasing. Matthew stood firm, his gaze unwavering. He could feel his heart pounding, but he didn't let it show. He did what he could, now it was up to Ricardo to make the next move. Natalia straightened, her expression hardening, becoming cold and hostile. This is ridiculous. I don't have to stand here listening to this nonsense, she said, grabbing her bag. But before she could leave, Ricardo's hand reached out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength for a man his age. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. Not until we find out what's going on here. The waiter, who had been paralyzed, finally spoke. Sir, should I call the police? The question sent a ripple of tension through the restaurant, and for the first time Natalia looked genuinely desperate. She shook her head violently. Don't you dare do that, it's just a misunderstanding, Ricardo, you can't be serious. Quote, but Ricardo held up his hand, silencing her. Yes, he said, addressing the waiter, his eyes never leaving Natalia. Call them. Mateus felt a sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The truth had not yet come out, and the tension was far from over. The restaurant held its breath as the waiter rushed inside to make the call. Ricardo released Natalia's wrist, his eyes never leaving hers. The impeccable charm she had worn so effortlessly was now crumbling, replaced by a growing sense of desperation. She looked around, her lips moving but no sound coming out, desperately searching for an escape. Meanwhile, Mateus stood a few feet away, his hands trembling slightly. He had done everything he could, but now he felt the weight of doubt creeping in on him. What if the man didn't believe him after all? What if she managed to get away with it? He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay in place. Matthew, Ricardo said suddenly, his voice cutting through the attention. You said you saw her putting something in the soup. Can you describe it? The boy nodded quickly, stepping forward. It was a small bottle, like the ones for medicine, with a clear liquid. She poured it out while you were looking at your phone and stirred it into the soup. I swear I saw it. Ricardo's face tightened. He turned to Natalia, who was already shaking her head. This is absurd. He's lying. Why me? But Ricardo interrupted her. Why would he lie? What could he possibly gain from this? The crowd murmured again, and the sound of sirens in the distance added to the tense atmosphere. Natalia's eyes darted toward the soup, and for a split second, her carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. She looked cornered. Then, as if clinging to one last hope, she turned to Matthew. You were spying on us because you're jealous of people who actually have something. The words hit Matthew like a slap, but he stood his ground. I'm not jealous, he said firmly. I saw what I saw, and I couldn't just stand by and let you hurt him. The sirens grew louder, and soon 2 police officers entered the restaurant. The room seemed to shrink as they approached the table, their hands resting on their belts. What's going on here? One of them asked, his tone neutral but authoritative. Ricardo stood, his imposing figure still commanding respect despite his age. Officers, I need you to take a look at this, he said, gesturing toward the bowl of soup. This kid claims my wife poisoned her. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions carefully neutral. One of them leaned over, sniffing the soup cautiously, and turned to Natalia. Ma'am, do you have anything to say to this? Her face turned red. This is ridiculous. He's just a street urchin trying to cause trouble. Ricardo, are you really going to let this nonsense go this far? But the police officer wasn't buying her excuses. We need to test the contents, he said, grabbing the bowl. No, Natalia shouted, her voice rising. Her outburst of anger drew even more attention, and her sudden panic only made her look guiltier. The police officer hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Ma'am, is there anything you'd like to tell us before we go any further? Natalia hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked at Ricardo, then at the officers, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse. Finally, her resolve crumbled. Fine. She spat, her voice low but full of venom. You want the truth? I'm tired of living in his shadow, tired of his control over everything. He should have never made it this year, and I stopped abruptly, realizing too late that I had said too much. The restaurant erupted in gasps, some customers taking out their cell phones to record the scene. Ricardo's face paled as the weight of her confession hit him like a truck. The police officer stepped forward, his expression grim. Ma'am, I'm arresting you for attempted murder. Please put your hands where I can see them. Natalia's composure completely shattered. She screamed, trying to free herself as they handcuffed her. You don't understand. I deserved everything he got. She screamed as they led her away, her voice echoing through the stunned restaurant. Ricardo sank into his chair, his hands shaking as he pushed his soup away. For a moment, he said nothing. His face was a mask of disbelief and betrayal. Then his eyes found Mateus, who stood there, unsure of what to do. But when Ricardo's gaze softened, a flicker of gratitude replaced the anger. In his expression, Mateus had not only saved his life, he had revealed a truth that Ricardo would never have seen. The restaurant slowly returned to its low murmur as the police escorted Natalia out, their protests fading into the distance. The customers exchanged wide-eyed glances, still shocked by what they had just witnessed. Some looked at Ricardo with pity, others with curiosity, but Mateus did not move. He stood still, unsure whether to stay or to quietly leave. Ricardo turned to the boy, his face still pale, but his eyes now steady. "Mateus," he said softly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit down." Matthew hesitated, looking around at the onlookers, but Richard's voice carried a weight that made him comply. Slowly, he sat back in the chair, his shoulders tense. "You saved my life," Richard said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know how I can thank you." Matthew shifted, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I just couldn't let that happen," he said quietly. "I couldn't just watch and do nothing." Richard nodded. His gaze went distant for a moment, as if he were reliving all the approval. "Most people would have," he said after a pause. "They would have turned their faces away, pretended they didn't see, but you didn't. That took courage." Matthew shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I just don't like seeing people get hurt, that's all." Richard leaned back, studying the boy for the first time. He seemed to really see him, not just as a ragtag kid from the streets, but as someone with a story, a soul. "How long have you been here?" The question took Matthew by surprise. He looked away, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "Oh," Richard frowned, but didn't press the question. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black cell phone. "Wait here," he said, standing up and walking away to make a call. Matthew watched him, unsure of what to do. His heart was pounding with anxiety. Was he in trouble? Now Richard was going to call someone to move him, but when Richard returned, his expression was calm, almost gentle. "Help is on the way," he said simply. "Help?" Matthew asked, frowning. Richard nodded. "I called someone I trust. They'll make sure you have a place to sleep tonight, a safe place. And if you'll let me, I'd like to do more than that." The boy's eyes widened. "You don't have to do this," he said quickly, his voice defensive. "I didn't do it for money or anything like that." Richard smiled slightly. "I know. That's why I want to help you. You did something most people wouldn't have done. And trust me, Matthew, if the world had more people like you, it would be a much better place." For the first time in a long time, Matthew felt a warmth he couldn't describe. He looked down, unsure of what to say. The restaurant's customers began to disperse, but the weight of what had happened hung in the air. Ricardo picked up his glass of water, taking a sip before speaking again. "Sometimes life gives us the chance to change someone else's story," he said thoughtfully. "You changed mine today, Matthew, and maybe, just maybe, I can help change yours." The boy looked up at him, his dark eyes shining with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, hope. As the two of them remained silent, the sun continued its path across the sky, casting long shadows over the restaurant. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone who witnessed the event. Courage doesn't always wear suits, and kindness doesn't always come from the rich. Sometimes it's the people we ignore who have the greatest strength of all. In the end, Matthew's bravery not only saved a life, but it reminded everyone in that restaurant of the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. If this story touched you, be sure to subscribe and join us for more tales of courage, truth, and redemption. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that even small actions can create life-changing impacts. Yeah.